We want to get pretty quickly to the way Facebook works. But since Facebook is a web application system, a web information system, all those are equivalent ways of saying the same thing. Since Facebook is a web system, we need to know first how do web systems work. So I've told you previously that the web consists of servers and browsers. The servers give information, they deliver information, they serve information, and the browsers consume information. They show information, they display information. The server runs on some computer up there in the internet, and the browser runs on your local computer, maybe on your phone, or maybe on your laptop, or maybe on your desktop computer. So we have this idea of browsers and servers so far, but now let's go a little bit deeper into it. And we're going to see how those browsers and servers work in a little bit more detail so that we can figure out how the browsers and servers inside of Facebook work. Okay, so let me give you a metaphor that you can begin with. And that's the idea of how television works. Hopefully you know pretty much how television works, right? There's a television station out there somehow broadcasting. It's creating the shows, it's doing all the production on the shows. That television station is responsible for creating the television show. Then it sends it out, it broadcasts it through these giant antennas, and maybe you've seen those antennas around where you live, those giant TV antennas that broadcast the television signal to all televisions. And the televisions receive the signal. The televisions know what to do to turn that signal into a television broadcast. Got the idea? Pretty simple. Television studio creates the information, the antennas broadcast that information all around, and the receivers, in fact television sets are also called receivers, the television sets get that information, they pick up the waves that the antenna has created, and the televisions know how to turn that into a television picture with sound and image synchronized. Okay, that's the idea of a television. Well, we can generalize that, or we can use that metaphor to see basically how the web is working. We have the same parts. We have the thing that's like the television station, and I've called that the server. The server is responsible for creating the information. We have the internet itself, which is responsible for broadcasting, distributing that information. And then we have the browser, which is responsible for receiving that information and seeing the presentation of that information. We have those same three parts. Now now that you have that basic idea, we're going to use a slightly different way of talking about these three parts. We're not going to talk about the server as being the sender. We're not going to talk about the server as being the creator. We're not going to talk about the internet as being the broadcaster. We're not going to talk about the browser as being the receiver or the displayer. Instead, we're going to use this idea of tiers. And this is very common. It's not a complicated idea. You'll get it after a while. The idea of a tier is that there are different places, there are different layers, there are different levels where things happen to the information. And so we usually talk about those tiers as going from close to you, the tier that's closest to you, the user, the consumer of information, all the way to the tier that's closest to the data, closest to the actual storage of the information. Okay, so let's look at those three parts now, but let's look at them with this different idea of the tiers, with what the tiers are and what they're responsible for. So we have the same diagram, the internet, the server, and the browser, but now we're going to call them by tiers. And we're going to, by the way, ignore the internet as a tier. We're just really going to think of the internet, well, that's just like the antenna that broadcasts a signal. There's no real need for us to call that out and give it a label. So from now on, we're going to sort of ignore the internet, which is kind of what you want from a network. You want that network to always be there, you want it to be useful, but when you're creating applications, you don't have to worry so much about the network. And that's what we do when we talk about tiers. So the first tier is the one that's in your browser. We call that the presentation tier, and it makes a lot of sense. The browser is there to present the information. So tier number one is the presentation tier. Tier number two on the server, we're going to generalize right now and just call it the processing tier. All the stuff that needs to happen to turn the data that you store somewhere into a great web page. That all happens on the server. And then behind the processing tier is the data tier. So this is a new thing we haven't talked about before. So far we've talked about the server as just being one big thing. You'll see as the further we go, the more we decompose that server into more and more and more things, because the server is a very complicated beast. It's a big machine that has lots of different parts. So far we've just called it the server. Now we're going to break it down into two parts. the processing part that does all the work, that does all the massaging, that does all the manipulation of the information, and then the data tier. Tier number 3, the data tier that stores the information. So in general, what happens is this processing tier reaches into the data tier, pulls out the information that's necessary to make a web page, does all the manipulations, turns it into HTML. Remember, HTML is the language of web pages, and then sends it to the browser. The browser, just like a television set, really doesn't know much to do except how to display what's sent to it from the server. Now, we can complicate that story quite a bit, and we're not going to spend much time complicating it on the presentation layer, but we will complicate it on the server. So before we do that, pause for a moment and get this concept, the concept of a tier. A tier is one place where information processing happens. We so far have 3 tiers, but we're going to see that there can be as many tiers as you want. The first tier that we've talked about is the presentation tier. That is the display of the information, and that's your browser or your phone, or could be a book, could be a printed book. That's also the presentation tier. Then we have the processing tier. That's on the server, that's on the web server, that does all the manipulations of information, and the data tier that stores the information. Okay, so all web systems are at least going to have that much of an architecture to them. And by the way, the word architecture is simply just a way of saying the way it's put together, how all the parts are put together, the schematic, the design of the system. Okay, so now we're going to complicate the picture a little bit. We're going to show a diagram that's a little bit more realistic. The diagram that I showed you previously is really kind of an artist's conception of how it works. Here's a diagram, and don't worry too much about what it's a diagram of, like what the particular system is. I just chose this picture randomly from the web to show a more complicated architecture. What I want you to see here is how it usually looks, how these tiers are in actuality when you have a more complicated system. So we still have on the top the browser that's receiving the page. We still have the internet, but notice the internet in this diagram is really reduced to just a little arrow. We don't care so much about the internet, and that's consistent with what I was saying earlier, that the internet is just kind of presumed to be there. We don't have a specific name for it in our architecture. It's just the pipes that get the information from place to place. But then we do have this server that's creating the page, but look at how complicated that server is. All sorts of interacting parts that have different names, all sorts of stuff going on with that server that's more complicated than just processing. And when we finally get to Facebook, we're going to look a little bit more in detail at how their server is put together and what the major parts and pieces are of it. Okay, so now we can look at this again from the idea of the tiers. Presentation tier, which is the browser or the web phone or the other PDA or whatever it is that you have. The processing tier and the data tier. Notice both the processing tier and the data tier are both on the server, loosely speaking on the server, that's what we'll say, but they're different parts and they're different named parts. So again, we have those 3 tiers, but notice the processing tier and the data tier themselves are more complicated and have lots of different parts to them. Okay, so that's where we're going. We have the 3 tiers, the presentation tier, the processing tier, and the data tier. And we're going to get now more sophisticated about them, and we're going to call them the tiers, and we're going to look at how those work in Facebook. So just as a final reminder, the idea of tiers. Complicated web systems have lots of different parts. We organize those parts into tiers to keep them separate, to be able to talk about them. We usually talk about at least 3 tiers, a presentation tier, a processing tier, and a data tier. And we label them as being further and further from you. So closest to you is the presentation tier. That's what you interact with the most. You open your browser, there's the presentation tier that's happening inside your browser. Further from you, across the internet on some server, is the processing tier. And then either on the same server or quite likely in the systems that we're going to study for sure, on other servers that are interconnected in lots and lots of different computers all talking to each other, is that data tier.